Good afternoon. My name is Murad Awawdeh. I'm the Director of Political Engagement at the New York Immigration Coalition. You're probably like, what is the New York Immigration Coalition? Well, we're a coalition of over 200 organizations across the state of New York. We have a member organization in every single county of this state. The NYC, short for the New York Immigration Coalition, fights for immigrant rights and immigrant justice in the state of New York and across the nation. We're an umbrella policy and advocacy organization that works with our memberships to activate their bases to ensure that we are fighting for the rights of all immigrants and refugees in New York. I'm going to speak to you guys a little bit about what brought me to this work. When I was 10 years old, I was growing up in a community called Sunset Park, and that's located in Southwest Brooklyn. My whole family had asthma, and that at the time seemed like something that was common, but it was common to only people in the community who also had asthma. My sister, almost every single day, would have a vicious asthma attack and end up waiting on the floor for an ambulance to come to take her to the ER. And that really spoke to me in a way where it was like, you know, come to think of it, no one in my family who lives elsewhere has to deal with this. So I started to look around my community and realized that my community wasn't identical to the communities to the sides of it. Park Slope on one side, Bay Ridge on the other. I noticed that we had no trees. I noticed that we had an enormous amount of trucks on our streets. I noticed that we had a highway and multiple power plants. And shortly after realizing that there was something inherently wrong with the living environment we were currently in, a group of young people started organizing. And they started organizing for environmental justice. And that didn't start off as like, yeah, we're going to fight for environmental justice. It started off as like, why don't we have clean air? Why don't we have clean air in a community that's low income, majority immigrant, and we're all facing the same issues? So shortly after that, we really started to educate each other on what was happening. A couple of nonprofit organizations started to provide us with support, and young people started to organize. And the power of organizing really was a testament within my childhood, and seeing that people power was real, and that it wasn't just something that you can't, like I'm a huge math fan, and sometimes the data doesn't match up to things that happen. And as the tech community and folks who are reliant on data and coding and everything else that really doesn't have a human impact at times, it's not measurable. It's not quantifiable. So to folks in Google and to folks within the tech community, I think sometimes we look at how the people perspective actually really does move forward in a way which is not definable by numbers. And shortly after, a group of young people that started off about 15, 20 to 25 young people defeated a multi-billion-dollar power plant. Thereafter, they planned a park on top of a Superfund site and then fought to get money from the state to clean up that Superfund site. And then it wasn't just fighting against, but fighting for, changing the landscape of what the community looked like. And that's my beginning to how I got into advocacy. And I was invited to speak today at Google to talk about how civic engagement, and to me civic engagement is organizing, how you can organize and participate civically to ensure that we are moving in the right direction to protect our communities from the uncertain times that we live in. And those uncertain times began on November 8, 2026, when our current president was elected. And we believed that everything he said was going to be literal. We didn't think that he was just speaking to his masses to get them riled up to vote for him. We figured he was going to do what he said he was going to do. Shortly after, it happened. Shortly after taking office, Donald Trump signed a number of different executive orders. The first was to double the size of Customs and Border Patrol. The same executive order was also intended to triple immigration enforcement officers and build the most inexpensive and wasteful wall ever. And when we saw that coming down the pike, we were like, okay, well, what we've seen in years prior, this before him, is that pretty much Customs and Border Patrol, which we as New Yorkers really don't interface with unless we're flying in to JFK and we see them at the airport. But we tend to forget that we have a northern border at the top of New York that is shared with Canada. Border Patrol can operate 100 miles within the radius of the wall, of the border. And what that means is, and any water, so we have the ocean, we have rivers, so they can, pretty much the entire state of New York is covered that CBP can come in and operate under. And what they do is pretty much, they have an enormous amount of power. So if you are driving through, from Canada into New York and you want to go back home after going to Montreal or Ontario, you have to stop and they can check you. And what tends to happen is that folks who are brown or black tend to get stopped more than others. Specifically, Muslim folks tend to get stopped and questioned at a higher rate than others. And as an Arab American Muslim, I think that the reality that we were in at that point when this executive order was issued was that our communities, and this is the broad sense of communities, immigrant communities, are going to be faced with an enormous amount of challenges moving forward. Shortly after that executive order was passed, there were rumors of the Muslim ban dropping sometime soon. We had heard that it was going to happen the same day. The next day, we heard it was going to happen that day. And then finally, about 3 days later, again, we took him by his word and he came through on it. So on January 26th, at about 4:42 p.m., Donald Trump signed an executive order banning people from 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering the United States. And what you may have seen like beautiful chaos that came out of it. And people felt in their hearts that it was wrong and they came out to the airport. And the New York Immigration Coalition was at the forefront of that. We knew it was coming down the pike and we knew that he was gonna fulfill his promise to his base. So we wanted to ensure that whatever was happening, that we were gonna ensure that the most impacted voices were gonna be at the front lines and make sure that folks who are impacted have some sort of defense. And that defense was done by lawyers. Precisely over 1,000 lawyers who showed up to JFK for free and fought for the release of everyone who was detained at the airport. Couple that with the enormous outpouring of support that we had from people coming out to protest. The numbers went up as high as 10,000 people showing up that day. And it was honestly quite beautiful to see. In the morning when we got there at around 8 o'clock in the morning, there was like 10 of us. Shortly after, it was about 25. We did a call to action on social media. And then media showed up. And then it went from 24 to over 10,000. To the point where the entire parking lot in Terminal 4, the parking garage, the passenger pickup area was filled to the brim with people demanding that those who had been detained to be released. Later that evening, Judge Donnelly in the Eastern District Court finally issued a temporary ban, a temporary injunction on the Muslim ban, which was quite remarkable. Later that evening, we plan to have a march to ensure that New York's voice was actually being heard across the nation, demanding that this ban is not going to stand. And what we did was we held a march and rally that started at Battery Park, overlooking the Statue of Liberty. And we thought originally we were going to have about like a couple thousand people coming out because a lot of folks went out the night before. But we were amazed that over 30,000 people showed up. And the reality is that everything, there's a cause and effect to everything. And what we've been seeing is that as people are becoming more civically engaged in their ensuring that their beliefs are not being challenged in a way where you don't feel as if we are honoring what our country was founded to do, that folks are really taking a stand now. And the stand isn't just, I'm gonna send out a quick tweet, which is amazing, or I'm gonna put a Facebook post up, which is great, but showing up, and showing up when it matters. The next thing that our federal government has done is issued an attack on sanctuary cities and threatened to defund cities through the Department of Justice. And what does that mean? What are sanctuary cities? Are sanctuary cities these lawless cities where people are like moving forward in life and doing whatever they want with no accountability? No. Sanctuary cities means that cities are not going to participate and assist in federal law enforcement agencies' attempt to detain people, which is not illegal. It is pretty much the Fourth Amendment. And I think that when people think about it, they're like, well, may seem odd, but it's not. New York City became a sanctuary city under not the very liberal mayor that we have now, Mayor de Blasio, not our centrist former mayor, who was Mike Bloomberg, who was pretty pro-immigrant. It happened under Rudy Giuliani, the same man who is Donald Trump's advisor right now. So the reason why he did it was because he wanted to ensure that everyone in the city was able to feel comfortable enough to go to law enforcement if something happened, was comfortable enough to go to the hospital if they were sick, was comfortable enough to ensure that their kids went to school. And I think the reality is that the rhetoric that we're hearing now is, quite frankly, bull. So when we're talking about how do we ensure that our communities are safe, sanctuary cities are not harboring people who are doing anything illegal. Sanctuary cities are ensuring that everyone has their rights. And I think that that's what it comes down to. So to go back to what else is happening nationally, everything that you hear tends to be that we're law and order, we're going to ensure that everyone who's here is fine, anyone with status is okay, we're only going after the criminal aliens. And that rhetoric is actually really dangerous because who is defined as a criminal alien? For instance, green card holders. These are folks who are legally permanent residents who may or may not have had a run-in or two with law enforcement on very low minor offenses, and now they are on track for removal. You also have, just 2 weeks ago, it was announced that a young person who had received DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals in California, actually was detained and then deported within 3 hours. DACA is intended to protect people from deportation. The United States government told these young people who received DACA, sign up for DACA. You will get work authorization. You will get a social security card number. You will get everything you need without status, but we will not focus on you to deport you. And obviously, in this current administration, that is not true. What else are we seeing nationally? We're seeing that enforcement of immigration enforcement is happening at a much higher rate. And you're seeing that there is retribution for people who are speaking out against this. So in cities in Texas that are sanctuary cities, there's been a higher rate of raids happening there. There's been higher enforcement in other cities that are technically sanctuary cities. And what we're seeing is that it's a very vindictive way of getting back at folks. They try to teach people a lesson. And that's not the country that we have ever been. We have a very interesting past, And I think that the future that we all intended to have is not the one that we're on track for right now. So what is the New York Immigration Coalition doing? We're working at the federal level to fight back as hard as we can against these policies that Donald Trump is introducing and signing. We're also ensuring that at the local level in our state, that we're putting together policies that will harden our state from these policies, so that when folks are trying to access documents from the state on who is, who has Medicaid, or who went to this hospital, or who went to that hospital, that there are policies put in place for that. Recently, we just had a pretty significant win where we worked with the city and the state to ensure that ICE isn't allowed in schools. To even think that that was allowed before, where children, kindergarten to 12th grade, are in school and and ICE can walk in, pick up a kid, is beyond me. We're working on ensuring that immigrants from across the state have access to legal services. There are studies that show that if an immigrant is undocumented, with documentation, or anything, and has legal representation during immigration proceedings, there's a higher rate of them being able to stay. We're helping those with status become citizens. There's been a very long period of time where, folks who have green cards are like, I don't really need citizenship because I have my green card, I'm fine. What we've realized is that that's not necessarily true. So we're trying to ensure that folks who are eligible to become citizens do become citizens. And the other thing that we're doing right now is fighting harder than we've ever fought before to ensure that services for integration are in place and funded for our newcomers. And what do I mean by that? Across the state and across the nation, there's always been this fight for adult literacy education funding. And what does that mean? That funding would specifically go out to educate folks on how to learn how to read and write English. And for being a country that everyone loves, that folks want to speak English, we don't fund it. We also don't fund the ability for people to get health care or healthcare services. So we want to ensure that we can expand the pool of who's eligible to get insurance. We want to ensure that folks who may have had a run-in that was a low offense see a lawyer. And that's not a big ask. And then looking at how we move the pendulum and looking at how we actually start discussing these issues, and we look at the tech community. A lot of these tech companies were founded and created by immigrants. A lot of folks think that, tech just happened. It doesn't just happen. There are people behind it. And I think that the reality is that we have gotten comfortable being who we are as just a person, not realizing where we came from or where we're going. And in that, we have to start challenging ourselves to be more vocal about where are we now? And how are our communities, our larger communities, our tech community, which will be impacted, our home community, how will that be impacted? And the generations to come, how will they be impacted? And what is your role in doing this? And what is your role to ensure that we're actually pushing the pendulum towards justice and not towards injustice? So what can you do? And I think that has been the new big question of the day. Everyone asks, what can I do? I want to do something, but I don't really feel comfortable speaking publicly, or I don't feel comfortable, going and writing op-ed or speaking to my elected official. There's a number of things folks can do. And the most important is speaking to your elected official, your federal officials, your state officials, and your local officials. First, you should know who they are. Second, you should call them often with your opinions and your concerns. They do take phone calls, emails, and letters, or even a visit, very seriously. So if they're hearing from you, and they're hearing that you're concerned about the immigration policies, or you're concerned about the restriction in H-1B visas, or you're concerned about your colleagues safety, that will go a long way. One thing that folks tend to forget is that we almost have an election every single year. So last year was the federal elections. This year we have city and municipal, local, regional elections. And one thing people think is that my vote doesn't really count. And then they point to the Electoral College. You know, sometimes I'm like, okay, well, there may be some true criticism there. But your vote does count. You count. And it's an entire process. You count. And the reality is that the most important elections are the local ones. And people tend to forget that. You have, if you live in New York City, you have city council races, you have the mayor's race, you have the public advocate's race, the city comptroller. If you live in other parts of the state, you have your county executive and your local legislator races. And across the nation, you have other races happening this year. There are a ton of special elections happening to fill vacancies for congressional members, which you've seen in which you will see in South Carolina, which you have seen in Georgia, and which you have seen in, I believe it was Kansas. So vote. If there is one thing you can do, and you just want to have that one thing be it, your vote matters. And your vote matters more than you actually think. There's races that have been won by 17 votes in this state. 17. It's like that last row. That last row decided an election. Voting is critical. More so today than it ever was before. Organize. Organize a community town hall. Know who your neighbors are. A lot of folks, and I think that this goes across the board, and not just in the tech community or the advocacy community, but in general, the vast majority of people do not know who their neighbors are. More than hello, good morning, good night, great seeing you, and that is it. Know who your neighbors are. Speak to your neighbors. See what their issues are, what their concerns are, and then organize together. Bring together the rest of your community to have a town hall or a community meeting. Hold it in your lobby at your building. Hold it in front of your house. Hold it at a library, anywhere. Organize. Get to know each other. Fight for a shared vision. That is the only way we can move forward here. Mobilize. Mobilizing yourself plus family and friends or colleagues is going to be critical. There's been a protest or a rally or a march literally almost every single week. How many have you been to? Right? Go to one. Make that like a task of the day. Just go to see what the rally's about. Who's doing what? Why are people here? Ask folks, like, what really brought you out today? Get yourself out. Get out of your comfort zone. Mobilize. This is what is going to be and what has been the only way to actually create change under this administration. You saw that with the American Affordable Care Act. You saw that with the Muslim ban. You're going to see that with everything else that's coming down the pike. So there's going to be a budget extender at the federal level. You should look through it, see what's going to be included and what's not, and then really ensure that you believe that your tax dollars are going to the right places. Mobilize. Educate. Seek out information from valid sources. I can't emphasize this any more than I have in the past couple of months, where people are sending me articles of things that I said, which are not things that I've said. I'm like, where did you hear this? There should be a video of it. Look at the video. And then look at the entire clip, not just 2 words of what I've said. I think research and education is extremely important. And I think that we're on a pathway that alternative facts have become normalized. And I think that we just have to call it what it is, and they're all lies. So how can you ensure that you are educating yourself and your community? Research and educate. Share the information that you have found with your colleagues. Share it with your family. Share it with your friends. I think educating yourself and your friends is really important. There are issues that I'm continuously learning about within immigration. And I think that that's something that is upon us all to really do. and to really look into things that are going to impact ourselves and our families and our community. Volunteer. You all have an acquired set of skills. Use it for good. Look at a nonprofit that you really want to volunteer with. Say, this is what I can do. Let me know if you're interested. If not, I'll just show up to whatever you're doing. More than likely, they will respond to you and say, thank you. We would love for you to work on this with us. Nonprofits across the state and the nation right now are not really equipped to respond to the level that they have been responding right now. So any assistance in volunteering your time or not is going to be really important for them to be able to become successful and even more successful and to continue to fight, because that's what it comes down to. Because in every victory, there's like 10 losses before that you probably don't even know about. So you just need to ensure that you're providing yourself and that you're making yourself available to these folks. Donate. I think that you hear this all the time. One standard that I like, not that I'm bragging because we are, is that we're a Google-approved nonprofit. And your donation will be matched by Google. So look through, if you want to donate to the New York Immigration Coalition, go for it. You should. If not, look for another nonprofit that's doing great work in your community that you want to support. And the last but not least is stay connected. A lot of things happen at a very rapid pace these days. And social media has become a really amazing tool to ensure that we are continuously following up with each other and making sure that we know what's happening and that we're getting out the right information in the quickest way possible. So follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook. Make sure that you text our Action Alert Network, which is right there. Text NYC to 864237. That's the right number, yes. And stay connected. I can't emphasize that more than anything. I think just being able, if you walk away from here doing one thing and texting that number is it, I think that that is in itself, you're on the right track to starting to become civically engaged in a way that you haven't been before. And showing up, because showing up is probably one of the most important pieces of this. So with that, I will take any questions. I want to thank Google for having me here today. I think there's microphones on either side of the stage. There's one there and one here.
Hi, thanks for coming. I just had a question about strategies for talking to people who disagree, because I think, especially at a place like Google, you don't find that many people who disagree with these things. And I've also been hearing a lot about how arguing with people doesn't really change anyone's mind. It just makes everyone more firmly committed to what they already believe. So what have you found that's effective for having constructive conversations with people who disagree with you?
That's a funny question. I actually had an off-the-record debate with someone last week who is completely against every single viewpoint and belief that I have. And it was interesting because I had prepared like for 3 days to ensure that I can counter every claim she has with actual facts. And I was like, that's really not gonna work here. So honestly, I heard her out and I listened to everything she said and I took notes and I was like, okay, thank you for letting me know how you feel. Now, this is what you said. This is how I heard it, and this is what the actual truth is. And we didn't agree on 100% of everything I mentioned to her. But from that conversation, I never expected this. We agreed on 5 points. And I was literally floored by her saying, yeah, of course I agree with that. One was that everyone deserves to live with dignity and respect. The other was that there is consequences to people's actions, but there shouldn't be a double punishment for anything. And that in itself was a huge deal because she's an enormous anti-immigrant fanatic. And I'm like, whoa, you just agreed with something that you've been going out and like really cheering your crowds with. Making sure that folks have the right to live not in fear. And making sure that people who do come here have opportunity and pathway for citizenship. And while we didn't agree on like 100 things, we agreed on those 5 really critical pillars that I think that allowed us to continue to have the conversation. You're not going to change anyone's mind in a day. You're not going to change their mind in a week or a month. It takes time. And I think that folks who have their set of beliefs have believed that for a very long time. So unless they are exposed and working alongside or hearing from other folks and educating themselves on the alternative opinion and not something that they're reading on a fake news site, I think that that is what's going to change people's hearts and minds.
Hi, I've heard the Trump, like one of the things the Trump administration has said is that they're going to punish sanctuary cities by cutting off like the federal funds. I was just wondering if you like know if like there's any strategies about like being discussed about that, because it's sort of insane. Because last I heard, we send about $1.20, $1.20 for every dollar we get from the government. So.
Yeah, not too familiar with that. I just know that our strategy, we do have an internal strategy, but our strategy right now is, what we know is that they kind of can't do that. And they're going to, if they haven't, they will be sued by a couple of different states because what they're doing is actually discriminatory in practice. And if you heard of our Attorney General Sessions last week's speech saying that New York City is lawless and is the most dangerous it's ever been because being a sanctuary city last week, and you heard the response from the NYPD, which is pretty much can be its own military force, really saying that if it weren't for being a sanctuary city, we would be extremely dangerous. And because we are a sanctuary city, we have the lowest crime rates ever. I feel like that side has spoken. Anyone on this side? No pressure.
Hey, I'm an immigrant, but I've spent my whole adult life here. But even so, it feels strange to tell people that were, born and raised here, this is how you should run your society to like benefit me. Even though if I believe in a cosmopolitan world and all that, do you have like any advice? Because it feels weird. Because it feels like you're just being like a rude house guest.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think it's more so about talking about your own story. And that's why I started off with mine. And I think that folks tend to forget that like we all came here from somewhere. It might not have been your parents, your grandparents, or even your great-grandparents, but we all came here. Like none of us are indigenous to this land unless we're Native American. So my personal story really does resonate with a lot of people. I didn't start off with saying that my family was first-generation immigrants here. The services that were built by the city and the state weren't really meant for us. We didn't have access to it because we didn't have translation services or cultural competency within these institutions. We made it work for ourselves. I started off with the story of my sister because it's really important for me, and that was what actually got me started on this pathway that I'm on now. Thankfully, we're all healthier than we were when we were children. But I think resonating with people on a personal level really does allow you to help build that bridge of a mutually shared vision to ensure that you're both fighting for, it doesn't have to be 100% the same fight, but you have shared principles that you can work together with and ensure that you're fighting alongside each other for each other. I think that that's what people tend to forget.
I want to build on that question. So I'm also an immigrant, but I guess being white, I don't have some of the issues that other people have to deal with. But there is a possibility if I do any activism that since I'm not a citizen, I would put myself at jeopardy of being able to stay here, right? So what are recommendations for if you want to contribute but you don't have citizen status, what are things you can risk and what are things you definitely shouldn't risk?
So I think that you have to have that kind of conversation with yourself. I'm not an attorney, so I will not give you any legal advice. But what I would say is, what level of activism are you comfortable with? Showing up to a protest is not illegal. Anyone, with status, without status, can do that. You have the right to be at a protest. You have the right to raise your voice. You have the right to be on social media saying what's happening is wrong. You have a right to share your story. You have a right to everything else that a U.S. citizen does, with the exception of voting. So I think exercising your rights as even a visa holder is very important. But you have to take care of yourself and make sure that you're not putting yourself in precarious situations. So if you're going to a protest and you know that people are going to be getting arrested, you might not want to be standing next to them when they do whatever they're going to end up doing. And that should go out to everyone. If you're going to a protest and there's going to be civil disobedience, and you know that there will be civil disobedience, and you're in kind of a different situation where your status may be in jeopardy, maybe being around that situation is not beneficial to you. But you can always show up to the NYC's events where we coordinate with the right agencies to ensure that we're doing everything to ensure that everyone who's there is protected and not going to have any issue for participating.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hello.
I guess this is kind of a broad question, but like in general, like what do nonprofits need like the most? Like, is there one thing, like is it money or is it like time or is it specific?
I think it's a little bit of both. So it is, I would say more so volunteer time with acquired skills. So we're always looking for volunteers. If you go to our website, which is on one of the slides, www.nyc.org, there's like a volunteer sign-up form, which is very specific. So we want to know as much information of what you can offer as possible so that we don't waste your time asking you down the road, like, hey, do you know how to do translation? Do you know how to do graphic design? Our website looks like it's going to fall. Can you help us with fixing it up on the back end? So that when you are participating, that's an actual in-kind donation, if you think about it. So what you're doing is providing nonprofits with a resource that they would have to eventually pay for if you don't provide your services. So I would say the volunteering part is more important, but almost equally important is the donations. A lot of the time, folks tend to forget that everything costs money. When you want to have a rally, you have to pay for permits, you have to pay for sound, you have to pay for signs, you have to pay for water. If it's cold, you have to pay for hand warmers. So you just want to make sure that you're taking care of the people who are coming. So you want to make sure that you have resources available to make the purchases you need to. Also, staff time. If you work at a nonprofit or you don't, you should know that while folks may think that we get paid millions of dollars, we do not. We're humbly paid. So I think that providing donations to help build capacity of organizations is extremely important as well. So I think volunteering is important, staying connected and donating.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any final questions? All right, this has been great. Thank you again for having me. Thank you for coming out. I'll be hanging out in the back for a few minutes if you guys have any questions. Thank you again.